The last human standing. The battlefield was silent, except for the low hum of dying machines and the crackle of distant fires. Smoke curled into the darkened sky, where once bright stars now flickered like dying embers, struggling to shine against the backdrop of war. In the heart of this desolation, surrounded by the wreckage of both human and alien technology, stood a lone figure. His armor, once polished and gleaming with the insignia of Earth's proud military, was now cracked and scorched, its edges jagged from countless battles. The visor of his helmet was shattered, revealing a face smeared with dirt and blood. But his eyes, they burned with something unbroken: defiance. Captain Jack Hunter was the last, the final human soldier standing after Earth had been reduced to nothing more than dust and echoes. The Xyrax Empire, a ruthless alien force that had conquered half the galaxy, had wiped out humanity in a single merciless strike. Earth's defenses, its fleets, its cities, all had crumbled under the weight of Xyrax's superior technology and overwhelming numbers. But they had missed something. They had missed him. Jack's breathing was steady, controlled, even as he stood surrounded by the towering forms of Xyrax war machines. Their sleek metallic bodies gleamed in the firelight, their weapons trained directly on him. He could hear the faint, mechanical clicking of their targeting systems locking onto his chest. Any normal soldier would have surrendered by now, dropped to their knees, and begged for mercy. But Jack wasn't here to surrender. He wasn't here to beg. As the Xyrax commander, a towering creature with skin like molten metal and eyes that glowed a cold, merciless blue, stepped forward, Jack tightened his grip on his plasma rifle. The weapon was nearly out of charge, just like him, but he had enough left for one final stand. The commander's voice crackled through a translator, its tone dripping with mockery. "Human," it hissed, its mouth curling into something resembling a grin. "You are alone. Your world is gone. Your people are extinct. Surrender, and your death will be swift." Jack didn't move. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, then spat a glob of blood onto the ground, right at the commander's feet. "You should have finished the job when you had the chance," he growled. His voice was hoarse, but steady, filled with a quiet fury that made even the Xyrax soldiers hesitate. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, all at once, the Xyrax opened fire. But Jack was already moving. With the precision of a soldier who had nothing left to lose, he dived behind a crumbling piece of debris, rolling to his feet and firing his plasma rifle in rapid bursts. The first two Xyrax fell before they even realized he had moved. The others scattered, their weapons spraying the battlefield with searing energy bolts. But Jack was a ghost, weaving through the wreckage with impossible speed. His mind was sharp, clear. Every movement was a calculation, every shot a message. "You may have destroyed my world, but you will never break me." The battle raged for what felt like hours, but Jack didn't tire. His muscles screamed, his wounds bled freely, but he kept going. Driven by something the Xyrax couldn't understand: human willpower. When the last Xyrax soldier fell, Jack stood amidst the smoking ruins, his rifle finally empty. He dropped it to the ground, his chest heaving, but his eyes still burning with that same defiance. The silence returned, heavier now, pressing against him like the weight of a dying world. Then, just as he was about to collapse, his communicator crackled to life. A voice, weak but unmistakably alive, echoed in his ear. "Anyone out there? This is Princess Lyra of Xylara. Please, if you can hear me. They've taken me. The Xyrax. They're going to destroy everything." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The Xylarian princess was more than just royalty. She was the symbol of the galaxy's last hope, the heir to a throne that could unite the scattered resistance forces. If the Xyrax had her, it meant they were planning something even worse than Earth's destruction. But Jack wasn't about to let that happen. Not while he was still breathing. With renewed purpose, he retrieved a small, hidden datapad from his belt, scanning the source of the distress signal. It was coming from deep within Xyrax Prime, the heart of the Empire, a place no one had ever entered and lived to tell about. Jack didn't hesitate. He set the coordinates in his ship, a battered but still functional interceptor-class fighter, and climbed into the cockpit. As the engines roared to life, he glanced back at the ruins of the battlefield one last time. "Hang on, Princess," he muttered, his voice low but filled with determination. "I'm coming for you." As his ship shot into the stars, heading straight into the belly of the beast, Jack knew one thing for certain. He might be the last human alive, but he was about to show the entire galaxy exactly what that meant. The mission begins. The stars stretched endlessly across the black canvas of space as Captain Jack Hunter's battered interceptor roared through the void. The hum of the engines was a comforting sound, steady and familiar, but Jack knew better than to relax. He was heading straight into the heart of enemy territory, and the Xyrax Empire didn't make a habit of letting intruders leave alive. The cockpit lights flickered as Jack adjusted the navigation system. The coordinates from Princess Lyra's distress signal pointed to Xyrax Prime, the Empire's capital and its most fortified stronghold. It wasn't just a planet. It was a floating fortress wrapped in layers of impenetrable defenses and guarded by the most advanced fleet in the galaxy. No one had ever attempted a solo mission into Xyrax Prime. No one had been reckless or desperate enough. But Jack wasn't just anyone. He was Earth's last soldier, and he had nothing left to lose. The journey through enemy space was like threading a needle blindfolded. Jack's ship skimmed along the edges of asteroid fields, ducked behind the debris of destroyed vessels, and navigated the narrow gaps between patrolling Xyrax cruisers. Every time the radar beeped with the proximity of an enemy ship, Jack's pulse quickened. The Xyrax scanners were some of the most sophisticated in the galaxy, capable of detecting even the smallest energy signature. But Jack's interceptor was fitted with old Earth tech, outdated by Xyrax standards, but unpredictable and hard to detect. As he drifted past the wreckage of a once proud Terran cruiser, Jack's mind wandered to the past. He could almost hear the echoes of his comrades' laughter, the hum of life that used to fill the halls of Earth's ships. Now it was all gone, reduced to floating tombs in the cold emptiness of space. But those memories didn't weaken Jack. They fueled him. Every fallen friend, every lost battle, was a reason to keep fighting. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost meaning in the endless dark. Jack barely slept, his eyes scanning the monitors, his hand steady on the controls. Then, just as he was starting to believe he might actually make it to Xyrax Prime unnoticed, the radar flared red. A Xyrax patrol fleet had locked onto his position. Jack's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a random patrol. They were expecting him. Someone had tipped them off. As the realization sank in, another face from his past flashed through his mind. Talon. Talon had been more than a friend. He was an alien mercenary from the Varnax system, a towering figure with skin like obsidian and eyes that burned like twin suns. They'd fought side by side during Earth's last stand, saving each other more times than Jack could count. But Talon had always been a survivor first, loyalty second. If the Xyrax had offered him the right price or the right threat, it wouldn't be hard to believe he'd sell Jack out. The comm system crackled, snapping Jack out of his thoughts. A cold, mechanical voice filled the cockpit. "Captain Jack Hunter, you are ordered to power down your vessel and prepare for capture. Resistance will result in immediate termination." Jack grinned, a fierce, defiant smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," he muttered, flipping a series of switches on his console. "Good luck with that." The interceptor's engines roared as Jack jerked the controls, sending the ship into a sharp dive toward the nearest asteroid field. The Xyrax ships followed, their sleek forms cutting through space like knives. Energy blasts sizzled past Jack's hull, close enough to make the metal groan from the heat. But Jack wasn't slowing down. He pushed the ship harder, weaving through the tumbling rocks with reckless precision. The asteroid field was dense, a chaotic maze of spinning debris and hidden dangers. But Jack knew how to turn chaos into an advantage. He ducked behind larger asteroids, using them as shields, then darted out to fire quick bursts at the pursuing ships. His plasma cannons were no match for the Xyrax's advanced shields, but he wasn't trying to destroy them. He was buying time. As he zigzagged through the field, Jack's mind raced. He couldn't outrun the fleet forever, and he couldn't fight them head-on. But maybe, just maybe, he could outsmart them. Spotting a cluster of volatile gas pockets hidden among the asteroids, Jack's grin widened. He steered the interceptor toward them, dodging enemy fire with the skill of a seasoned pilot. As he neared the gas pockets, he fired a single, well-aimed shot. The explosion was immediate and massive, a brilliant fireball that lit up the dark like a second sun. The shockwave rippled through the asteroid field, sending rocks and debris flying in all directions. The Xyrax ships were caught in the blast, their shields flaring as they struggled to maintain control. Jack used the chaos to his advantage. He punched the throttle, pushing the interceptor to its limits as he broke free from the asteroid field. The Xyrax fleet was still behind him, but they were scattered and disoriented. It was the opening he needed. But as he sped toward Xyrax Prime, the weight of betrayal gnawed at him. Talon's face lingered in his mind, a bitter reminder that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. If Talon had sold him out, who else knew about his mission? And how deep did the Xyrax's network of spies go? The questions would have to wait. As Xyrax Prime loomed into view, its massive, fortress-like structure casting a shadow over the stars, Jack knew the hardest part was just beginning. The planet's defense grid was already locking onto him, and he had only moments to act. His fingers flew over the controls, activating the interceptor's cloaking system, an ancient piece of tech from Earth's forgotten wars. It wouldn't hold for long, but it might give him the window he needed to slip through the defenses. As the ship drifted silently toward the planet's surface, Jack took a deep breath. The odds were impossible, the mission suicidal. But none of that mattered. Princess Lyra was counting on him, and Jack Hunter didn't fail. Not now. Not ever. The Fortress of Shadows. The skies above Xyrax Prime were like nothing Jack Hunter had ever seen. Dark, heavy, and pulsing with an unnatural energy. Unlike any other planet in the galaxy, Xyrax Prime wasn't just a world. It was a living, breathing fortress. Its towering spires pierced the clouds like jagged teeth, glowing with an eerie greenish light that seemed to pulse in time with Jack's own heartbeat. The atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating, as if the planet itself wanted to choke the life out of anything that dared trespass. Jack's interceptor, cloaked in Earth's old stealth technology, drifted silently through the thick metallic clouds. Below, the massive city fortress stretched endlessly, a maze of dark corridors, massive towers, and shadowed streets. The Xyrax had built their empire on fear, and Xyrax Prime was the heart of that fear. Every structure, every spire, every flickering light seemed designed to intimidate, to remind anyone who looked upon it that resistance was futile. But fear was something Jack Hunter had long since abandoned. His ship descended toward a narrow docking bay, carved into the side of a colossal tower. This wasn't the main entrance. It was a forgotten maintenance port he discovered through old resistance schematics, a relic from a time when the galaxy still believed the Xyrax could be fought on equal footing. Jack knew it was risky. If the Xyrax detected him, the mission would be over before it began. But stealth had always been humanity's strength, and Jack was betting everything on that one advantage. As the ship settled into the docking bay, Jack powered down the systems and grabbed his gear. His plasma rifle was fully charged, his armor patched as best as he could manage, and his mind was focused. He had one goal: find Princess Lyra and get her out alive. The hatch hissed open, and Jack stepped into the fortress. The air was colder than he expected, with a faint metallic tang that clung to his tongue. The walls of the corridor were made of a strange black material that seemed to absorb light, casting everything in an unnatural shadow. Jack's footsteps echoed softly as he moved, his senses on high alert. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It felt alive, like the walls themselves were watching him. As he crept deeper into the fortress, Jack noticed something strange. The layout didn't match the schematics he'd studied. Corridors twisted in impossible ways, staircases led to dead ends, and doors appeared where none should exist. It was as if the fortress was shifting around him, a maze that changed with every step. And then he heard it. At first, it was just a faint whisper, barely more than the sound of the wind. But as he moved forward, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't speaking any language Jack recognized, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of fear, of despair, of countless voices crying out in agony. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. This wasn't just a prison. The Xerax were using something unnatural to guard their prize. Turning a corner, Jack froze. Standing in the middle of the corridor was a figure. It was tall, too tall, its body thin and stretched like it had been pulled out of shape. Its skin was a deep, shimmering black, blending into the shadows around it. But its eyes were a piercing, unnatural green, glowing like twin beacons in the dark. Jack didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The plasma bolt hit the figure square in the chest and passed right through it. The thing didn't even flinch. Instead, it tilted its head, almost curiously, as if it was studying him. Then, without a sound, it began to move, gliding toward him with unnatural speed. Jack cursed under his breath, backing away as he fired again and again. But the shots did nothing. The figure, whatever it was, seemed immune to his weapons. As it closed the distance, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Cold, raw fear. But he wasn't about to let it stop him. Spotting a side corridor, Jack dove to the left, rolling to his feet as he sprinted down the hall. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears, but he pushed them aside, focusing on the mission. He needed to find Lyra. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop him. After what felt like an eternity, Jack burst into a large chamber. The walls here were different, smoother, with strange, glowing symbols etched into the surface. And in the center of the room, suspended in a beam of green light, was Princess Lyra. She was unconscious, her body floating several feet off the ground, her long silver hair drifting around her like a halo. Her face was pale, but peaceful, as if she was in some kind of deep sleep. But Jack could see the faint lines of energy pulsing around her, connecting her to the strange symbols on the walls. Whatever the Xerax were doing to her, it wasn't just imprisonment. They were using her. Jack approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for traps. But the moment he stepped into the beam of light, the whispers stopped, and the figure from the corridor appeared. It materialized out of the shadows, its eyes burning brighter than before. But now Jack could see it more clearly. It wasn't just a guard. It was something older, something ancient. The Void Guardian. The thing spoke, its voice a chorus of the same whispers that had haunted Jack since he entered the fortress. "You do not belong here, human. Leave or be consumed." Jack's jaw tightened. He raised his rifle, knowing it wouldn't work but unwilling to back down. "You'll have to do better than that." The Void Guardian surged forward, faster than Jack could react. Its shadowy form wrapped around him, cold and suffocating. Jack struggled, his vision blurring as the thing's cold presence seeped into his mind, showing him visions of Earth's destruction, of his friends dying, of his own inevitable failure. But Jack Hunter was more than just a soldier. He was the last human, and humanity didn't know how to quit. With a roar of defiance, Jack activated a hidden pulse grenade on his belt. The device exploded with a burst of electromagnetic energy, disrupting the Void Guardian's form, just enough for Jack to break free. Staggering to his feet, Jack rushed to Lyra's side. He didn't know how to disable the energy field, but he didn't have time to figure it out. Trusting his instincts, he ripped the power core from his plasma rifle and slanted into the control panel. The field flickered, then collapsed. Lyra fell into his arms, her eyes fluttering open as the fortress trembled around them. "We have to go," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse but determined. But as they turned to leave, the Void Guardian reformed, its eyes burning brighter than ever. And Jack knew this was far from over. Escape through fire. The fortress shook beneath Jack Hunter's boots as he dragged Princess Lyra through the dim, twisting corridors of Xyrax Prime. The ancient walls groaned as if the very heart of the planet had been disturbed by her sudden release. Jack didn't need a translator to know what that meant. The Xyrax knew she was free, and they were coming. Fast. Lyra was still groggy, her legs barely cooperating as she leaned against Jack for support. Her silver hair clung to her face, damp with sweat, and her pale skin glowed faintly in the flickering emergency lights. But her violet eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, were sharp. "They're connected to me," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible over the growing alarms echoing through the halls. "They know where we are. They can feel me." Jack gritted his teeth, tightening his grip on his plasma rifle. He wasn't surprised. The Xyrax didn't just imprison their enemies. They turned them into tools, extensions of their empire's will. Whatever they'd done to Lyra inside that energy cocoon wasn't just to hold her captive. They were using her as a living beacon. And now, with her free, the entire fortress was hunting them. They rounded a corner and stumbled into a massive open chamber. High above, the ceiling stretched into darkness, while the floor was a maze of catwalks and metal platforms suspended over a bottomless abyss. Streams of green energy pulsed through massive conduits along the walls, feeding the fortress's core systems. It was a nightmare of alien engineering, a labyrinth designed to confuse, disorient, and trap anyone foolish enough to enter without permission. Jack didn't have time to be impressed. The quickest route to his ship was straight through this death trap. Suddenly, Lyra's body stiffened. She gasped, clutching her head as her eyes rolled back. "They're coming," she hissed. "The void, it's awake." Jack barely had time to process her words when the shadows around them began to move. Not just flicker or shift, but move, like living things peeling themselves from the walls and floors. The Void Guardian had returned, and this time it wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, their forms fluid and unnatural, their glowing green eyes fixed on Jack and Lyra, cold and merciless. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the remnants of the void itself, ancient sentinels bound to the fortress long before the Xyrax claimed it. Jack's pulse quickened. His rifle was low on power, and the pulse grenades he'd used earlier had barely slowed the Guardian down. But he didn't have a choice. Running wasn't an option, not with Lyra barely able to stand. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice steady despite the odds. "And when I say run, run." Without waiting for a response, Jack opened fire. The plasma bolts sliced through the air, searing holes in the shadows, but the figures didn't falter. They moved like liquid darkness, reforming as quickly as Jack could tear them apart. For every one he dropped, two more emerged from the walls, closing the distance. Jack backed onto a narrow catwalk, pulling Lyra with him. The metal groaned under their weight, swaying precariously over the abyss. One misstep, and they'd be swallowed by the endless void below. But Jack didn't let that slow him. He fired in controlled bursts, aiming for the glowing eyes, the only sign of weakness he could find. Still, it wasn't enough. One of the shadow creatures lunged, its claws raking across Jack's armor. The reinforced plating held, but the force of the blow sent him sprawling. His rifle skidded across the catwalk, teetering on the edge. Jack scrambled to his feet, but the shadows were already closing in. Then something unexpected happened. Lyra, still leaning against the railing, lifted her hand. Her eyes, once clouded with exhaustion, now glowed with a brilliant violet light. The air around her crackled with energy, and for a moment, even the shadows seemed to hesitate. "You will not take me," she whispered, her voice filled with a strength Jack hadn't heard before. A pulse of raw energy burst from her outstretched hand, slamming into the nearest shadow creature. The thing shrieked, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, vibrating through Jack's bones. The shadows recoiled, retreating from Lyra's light, as if it burned them. Jack didn't waste the opportunity. He dove for his rifle, grabbed it, and fired a final burst into the retreating shadows. Then he grabbed Lyra's hand. "Now," he shouted. "Run." They sprinted across the catwalk, the fortress trembling beneath them. The shadows regrouped quickly, flowing after them like a tide of living darkness. But Lyra's energy pulse had bought them precious seconds, and Jack wasn't about to waste them. As they neared the exit, Jack spotted a massive conduit running along the wall, pulsing with green energy. An idea sparked in his mind. Reckless, dangerous, but their only shot. "Lyra, keep them off me," he barked, skidding to a stop. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and pulled a detonation charge from his belt. "What are you doing?" Lyra gasped, her voice strained as she focused on holding back the shadows. "Buying us a ticket out of here." Jack slapped the charge onto the conduit and set the timer for 30 seconds. The moment he hit the activation switch, the conduit began to spark and hum violently, the energy inside destabilizing. "Go," Jack shouted, pulling Lyra down another corridor as the fortress began to shudder violently. They sprinted through the winding halls, the sounds of the explosion echoing behind them. The detonation had triggered a chain reaction, sending waves of destructive energy rippling through the fortress's core systems. Lights flickered and died, alarms blared in every direction, and the very walls seemed to pulse with fury. But the shadows weren't done. As they rounded the final corner toward the docking bay, the Void Guardian materialized once more, its form larger and more defined than before. It blocked their path, its glowing eyes filled with ancient rage. "You will not escape," it hissed, its voice a chorus of 1,000 whispers. Jack stepped in front of Lyra, raising his rifle one last time. But before he could fire, Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," she whispered. "This is my fight." Jack hesitated, then nodded. He stepped back as Lyra raised both hands, her entire body glowing with violet light. The air around them crackled, and the fortress itself seemed to shudder in response. With a scream that echoed through the very walls of Xyrax Prime, Lyra unleashed a torrent of pure energy. The Void Guardian shrieked in defiance, but it was no match for the raw power coursing through her. The shadows were torn apart, disintegrating into nothingness as Lyra's light filled the corridor. When it was over, Lyra collapsed into Jack's arms, her energy spent, but the path was clear. Jack carried her the rest of the way to the docking bay, where his battered interceptor waited. As they strapped in, Jack powered up the engines, his heart pounding. The fortress was collapsing around them, but Jack didn't care. They'd made it this far, and he wasn't about to let the Xyrax win now. With a roar of defiance, the interceptor blasted out of the docking bay, weaving through the crumbling spires of Xyrax Prime as the fortress burned behind them. But Jack knew this wasn't the end. The galaxy was watching, and the Xyrax weren't done. But neither was he. The galaxy strikes back. The cold, black expanse of space stretched infinitely around them. But Captain Jack Hunter had no illusions of safety. As the battered interceptor tore away from the crumbling spires of Xyrax Prime, the stars ahead shimmered unnaturally, their light warped by the presence of something far more dangerous than the void itself. The Xyrax fleet. Dozens, no, hundreds, of ships emerged from the darkness, their sleek, obsidian forms glinting like the teeth of some vast, hungry beast. They filled the space before Jack, forming an impenetrable wall of death. From small, agile fighters to massive dreadnoughts bristling with weapons, the Xyrax had mobilized their entire armada. And every single ship had its weapons trained on him. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady on the controls. Beside him, Princess Lyra stirred in the co-pilot's seat, her violet eyes flickering open. She was pale, her body still weak from the energy she'd unleashed against the Void Guardian. But there was a spark in her gaze, a defiance that matched Jack's own. "They're here," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. Jack smirked, a grim, determined curve of his lips. "Yeah, I noticed." The comm system crackled to life, and the cold, mechanical voice of the Xirax commander filled the cockpit. "Captain Jack Hunter, surrender the Zilarian princess immediately. There is no escape. Resistance will result in your annihilation." Jack snorted, flicking the switch to mute the transmission. "Same song, different day," he muttered. But deep down, he knew this was different. This wasn't just a patrol fleet or a random encounter. The Xirax had pulled out all the stops. They weren't just trying to capture Lyra. They wanted to make an example out of him, to show the galaxy that no one, not even the last human, could defy the Xirax Empire and live. But Jack Hunter wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. His mind raced as he scanned the battlefield. The interceptor was fast, but it was damaged, and its weapons were nearly depleted. The stealth tech had burned out during their escape from Xirax Prime, and the shields were barely holding together. He couldn't outrun them. He couldn't outgun them. But maybe, just maybe, he could outthink them. Jack's fingers danced over the controls, activating a hidden panel beneath the dashboard. Lyra's eyes widened as she saw what he was doing. "What is that?" she asked, her voice filled with both curiosity and concern. Jack's grin widened. An old Earth trick, something the Xirax thought they'd destroyed with the rest of humanity. He revealed a small cylindrical device embedded in the ship's core systems. It hummed with a faint blue light, its surface etched with ancient Turan runes. This wasn't just any weapon. It was a relic from Earth's darkest days, a prototype that had never seen the light of battle. The pulse cannon. "It's designed to disable enemy tech," Jack explained quickly. "It sends out an electromagnetic pulse so powerful it fries every system in a 100-mile radius. But it's risky. If it doesn't work, well, we'll be dead before we even know it." Lyra nodded, her gaze steady. "Then we make it work." Jack chuckled. He liked her spirit. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, then slammed the activation switch. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The cockpit lights flickered, the ship's engine sputtered, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. Then, all at once, the pulse cannon fired. A blinding wave of blue energy exploded from the interceptor, spreading out in all directions like ripples in a pond. The Xirax fleet was caught completely off guard. One by one, their ships shuddered, their lights flickering before dying altogether. Engines stalled, weapons powered down, and communication signals were severed. The entire armada was thrown into chaos. Jack didn't waste a second. He jammed the throttle forward, pushing the interceptor through the disoriented fleet. The Xirax ships drifted helplessly in the void, their systems fried by the pulse. But Jack knew it wouldn't last. The Xirax tech was advanced. They'd reboot in minutes, maybe even seconds. As the interceptor tore through the battlefield, Jack's eyes darted to the navigation system. They needed a place to regroup, to repair, to plan their next move. But there was nowhere safe. Nowhere the Xirax couldn't find them. Unless... Lyra's voice cut through his thoughts. "Head for the Nebula Rift," she said suddenly, her eyes alight with a strange, determined fire. Jack frowned. "The Rift? That place is a death trap. The gravitational storms alone." "They won't follow us there," Lyra interrupted, her voice firm. "But I know how to navigate it." Jack hesitated for only a moment. Then he nodded. "Hold on." The interceptor banked sharply, angling toward the swirling, chaotic mass of the Nebula Rift. The Xirax ships were already beginning to recover, their lights flickering back to life. But it was too late. Jack punched the engines, and the interceptor shot into the heart of the nebula, disappearing into the swirling maelstrom of gas, dust, and gravitational anomalies. Inside, the world was chaos. The nebula pulsed with violent storms, tendrils of electricity arcing between massive clouds of cosmic dust. The ship rocked violently, the controls fighting Jack every step of the way. But Lyra was right. The Xerax wouldn't follow them here. Their ships were too big, too rigid. The rift would tear them apart. But even with the Xerax left behind, the danger was far from over. As they navigated deeper into the rift, Lyra turned to Jack, her expression serious. "There's something you need to know," she said quietly. "Something about me." Jack arched an eyebrow, but kept his eyes on the controls. "This isn't exactly the best time for confessions, Princess." But Lyra pressed on. "The Xerax weren't just holding me captive. They were trying to unlock something inside me. Something ancient." Jack's grip on the controls tightened. "What do you mean?" Lyra took a deep breath, her eyes glowing faintly with that same violet light from before. "My ancestors weren't just rulers of Zilara. They were guardians of an ancient power, a force that predates even the Xerax. It's buried deep in my DNA, passed down through generations. The Xerax wanted to use it to control the galaxy." Jack's mind raced. This wasn't just about rescuing a princess anymore. Lyra wasn't just a symbol of hope. She was hope. The key to defeating the Xerax once and for all. "So what do we do now?" he asked quietly. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "We fight back. But first, we have to get to Zilara. It's the only place where I can unlock my full potential." Jack nodded slowly, his mind already working on the next steps. "Then let's get you home." But as they pushed deeper into the nebula, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was only just beginning. The Xerax wouldn't give up easily, and whatever ancient power lay inside Lyra, it was powerful enough to reshape the galaxy, for better or worse. The final stand. The twin suns of Zilara cast an ethereal glow over the horizon as Captain Jack Hunter's interceptor pierced the planet's thin atmosphere. The once beautiful world below, known for its sprawling crystal cities and verdant forests that shimmered under the twin lights, was now a war-torn wasteland. Fires burned in the distance, their smoke mingling with the golden sky, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of destruction. Jack had seen this before, on Earth, on countless other worlds, but seeing it here, on Lyra's home planet, hit differently. This was the last stand. If Zilara fell, the galaxy's hope would fall with it. In the co-pilot's seat, Princess Lyra stirred. Though her body still showed signs of exhaustion from the energy she'd unleashed back on Xerax Prime, her spirit had hardened. The violet glow in her eyes had grown stronger since their escape through the nebula rift, and Jack could feel the energy radiating off her like a second sun. Whatever ancient power she carried in her blood, it was awakening. But whether she could control it in time was another question entirely. The interceptor systems crackled as Jack guided the ship through a field of wreckage. Destroyed Xerax fighters, broken Zalarian defense drones, and the floating remains of a once mighty orbital station. The Xerax fleet had arrived before them, and judging by the state of the planet, they'd already begun their final assault. Jack set the ship down in a hidden clearing outside the capital city of Ilaris, or what was left of it. The towering crystal spires that once gleamed like beacons of hope were now reduced to jagged ruins, their shattered remains reflecting the fires that raged through the streets. But amidst the chaos, Jack saw movement. Zalarian resistance fighters, their armor battered, their faces grim, but their resolve unbroken. As Jack and Lyra disembarked from the interceptor, they were immediately surrounded by a squad of armed fighters. Their weapons were trained on the newcomers, their distrust evident, but when they saw Lyra, their expressions shifted from suspicion to shock. "Princess Lyra," one of them whispered, lowering his weapon. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from disbelief. "We thought you were dead." Lyra straightened, the weariness in her limbs momentarily forgotten. She stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "I was taken, but not defeated," she declared. and I have returned to lead Zilara in its darkest hour. We will not fall." A murmur rippled through the fighters, hope flickering in their eyes for the first time in what must have been weeks. But Jack knew hope alone wouldn't win this battle. They needed a plan. They needed strategy. Hours later, inside the battered remains of an old Zilarian command center, Jack stood over a holographic map of the city. The resistance leaders gathered around him, their faces etched with exhaustion, but attentive as Jack outlined their next moves. Lyra stood beside him, her presence alone enough to rally the fighters, but it was Jack's experience, Earth's forgotten battle strategies, that gave them a fighting chance. "The Ziracs think they've already won," Jack began, his voice steady. "They're overconfident. They believe their numbers and tech make them unstoppable. But that's where they're wrong." He pointed to key choke points on the map, narrow streets where the Ziracs' larger war machines couldn't maneuver, hidden tunnels beneath the city that could be used for surprise attacks, and old power grids that, if reactivated, could disrupt the Ziracs' communications. "We'll hit them where they least expected," Jack continued. "We'll turn this city into a trap, and when they're disoriented, we strike with everything we've got." The plan was simple, but it relied on timing, coordination, and most of all, courage. The Zilarian fighters, inspired by Lyra's return and Jack's leadership, nodded in agreement. They were ready. But as they prepared for battle, Jack pulled Lyra aside. "There's something you're not telling me," he said quietly, his eyes searching hers. "This power inside you, what happens when you unlock it?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she admitted. "My ancestors, they were guardians of an ancient force, but it's not just power, Jack. It's alive. It has its own will. If I can't control it." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jack understood. If Lyra couldn't harness the power within her, it could consume her, and potentially everything around her. But they had no choice. The Ziracs were too powerful. This was their only chance. As dawn broke over Zilara, the final battle began. The Ziracs' army poured into the city, their war machines crushing everything in their path. But they didn't expect resistance. They didn't expect Jack Hunter. The first wave of attacks came from the shadows. Zilarian fighters, using the tunnels beneath the city, launched surprise strikes against the Ziracs patrols. Explosions rocked the streets as carefully placed charges brought down buildings onto unsuspecting enemy troops. Jack led a squad through the narrow alleyways, his plasma rifle blazing as they ambushed Ziracs units from hidden vantage points. The city became a battlefield of chaos and fire. But amidst the destruction, Jack saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. The Zilarian fighters, once beaten and demoralized, fought with renewed vigor, their belief in victory reignited by Lyra's return and Jack's leadership. But the Ziracs weren't going down without a fight. As the battle raged, a massive shadow fell over the city. Jack looked up and felt his blood run cold. A Ziracs dreadnought, larger than any ship he'd ever seen, descended from the clouds. Its weapons glowed with deadly energy, and from its underbelly, legions of Zirac soldiers poured onto the streets. The final wave had arrived. Jack regrouped with Lyra near the heart of the city, where the last of the Zilarian resistance was making its stand. The situation was dire. Their numbers were dwindling, and the Ziracs were closing in from all sides. "It's time," Jack said, turning to Lyra. "You need to unlock that power. Now." Lyra nodded, her eyes glowing brighter than ever. She stepped into the center of the ruined square, her arms raised as she began to chant in an ancient language Jack didn't understand. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the air around her shimmered with raw energy. The Ziracs noticed immediately. They redirected their forces toward her, realizing the threat she posed. Jack and the remaining fighters formed a protective circle around Lyra, holding the line as the enemy advanced. But just as the Ziracs broke through their defenses, Lyra unleashed her power. A blinding wave of violet light erupted from her, sweeping across the battlefield. The Zyrax soldiers were caught mid-charge, their bodies disintegrating into ash as the energy consumed them. The dreadnought above shuddered, its systems failing as the wave of power reached it. With a deafening roar, the massive ship plummeted from the sky, crashing into the outskirts of the city in a fiery explosion. When the light faded, the battlefield was silent. The Zyrax were gone. But Lyra lay unconscious in Jack's arms, her body limp, her breathing shallow. Jack held her tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. "Come on, princess," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Stay with me." For a moment, it felt like the entire galaxy was holding its breath. Then, Lyra's eyes fluttered open, the faintest smile playing on her lips. "We did it," she whispered. Jack chuckled, relief flooding through him. "Yeah," he said softly. "We did." But as he looked out over the ruined city, he knew this was only the beginning. The Zyrax had been defeated here, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. Humanity's legacy. The twin suns of Zilara were setting, casting long shadows over the war-torn city of Ilaris. The once glimmering spires of crystal were now shattered ruins, their fragments reflecting the dying light like scattered pieces of a broken dream. Fires still smoldered in the distance, sending plumes of smoke spiraling into the sky. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air wasn't filled with the sound of blaster fire or the heavy tread of Zyrax war machines. It was over. The battle for Zilara had been won. Captain Jack Hunter stood at the edge of what had once been the city's central square, his battered armor streaked with soot and blood. His plasma rifle hung loosely at his side, its charge depleted, but it didn't matter anymore. The Zyrax Empire, which had seemed invincible only days before, had suffered a defeat they'd never anticipated. The Zalarian princess, the key to their plans for domination, had not only escaped but turned their greatest weapon against them. Jack's gaze drifted to Princess Lyra, who sat quietly on the remains of a fallen column, her silver hair glinting in the fading light. Her violet eyes, once filled with exhaustion and uncertainty, now burned with a calm, steady strength. The power she had unleashed during the final battle had reshaped the very course of the galaxy, but it had come at a cost. She moved slowly, her body still recovering from the overwhelming force that had surged through her veins. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Lyra finally spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "They'll come back, won't they?" Jack didn't need to ask who they were. The Zyrax weren't the type to accept defeat. They might be licking their wounds now, but the Empire had deep roots, and Jack knew they'd be planning their next move. The war wasn't over, not really. But something fundamental had changed. The galaxy had seen the Zyrax bleed. They'd seen that the Empire could be beaten. "Yeah," Jack said, his voice low. "They'll come back. But next time, they'll find a galaxy ready for them." Lyra nodded slowly, as if she'd already accepted this truth. She turned to face Jack, her eyes searching his. "I want you to stay, Jack. Help rebuild Zilara. Help lead the fight when they return." Jack felt a pang in his chest. The idea of staying, of finally putting down roots after all he'd lost, was tempting. But he knew himself too well. Earth was gone, his people scattered or dead, but his mission wasn't over. The galaxy was vast, and there were other battles to fight, other people to protect. "I can't stay," he said quietly. "I'm not the kind of guy who settles down. But that doesn't mean I'm disappearing. If the Zyrax come back, I'll be there." Lyra's expression softened, but there was no disappointment in her eyes, only understanding. "I know," she whispered. "But he'll always have a place here, on Zilara." Jack gave her a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. He reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small worn earth insignia, the last symbol of a world that no longer existed. He pressed it into Lyra's hand. "Keep this," he said, "a reminder that humanity never quits, no matter how bad things get." Lyra closed her fingers around the insignia, her gaze never leaving his. "I won't forget," she promised. The following day, under the light of Zilara's rising suns, Jack prepared to leave. The interceptor, patched together with parts scavenged from the battlefield, stood ready at the edge of the city. It was far from perfect, but it was enough to get him where he needed to go. As he strapped into the cockpit, Lyra appeared at his side, her hand resting lightly on the ship's hull. "Where will you go?" she asked. Jack chuckled softly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Wherever I'm needed," he replied. "The galaxy's a big place. I'm sure there's trouble out there with my name on it." Lyra laughed quietly, the sound light and musical despite the weight of their parting. "Be careful, Jack Hunter," she said, her voice tinged with something deeper, something unspoken. Jack met her gaze one last time, his expression softening. "Always." With that, the interceptor's engines roared to life, lifting the battered ship into the sky. Jack's heart clenched as Zilara shrank below him, the city of Illyris glowing faintly in the morning light. But he didn't look back. The future was out there, in the stars. As the interceptor broke through the atmosphere and slipped into the vastness of space, Jack allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He was the last human, the final echo of a world that had been wiped from existence. But Earth's legacy wasn't in its cities or its technology. It was in him. In every act of defiance, in every battle fought for freedom, in every corner of the galaxy where someone dared to stand up against tyranny, humanity lived on. Jack Hunter wasn't just a soldier. He was a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the universe, one human could make a difference. And as long as he was out there, the galaxy would never forget. The stars stretched endlessly before him, and Jack Hunter, Earth's last warrior, accelerated into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because humanity wasn't just about surviving. It was about fighting back.